Hello, my name is David Fielder. I'm an actor and here to represent a talk by Eugene Halliday, which was given by him to a small group in the northwest of England during the late 1950s, early 60s. It is unique in that the group listening to him seem unfamiliar with his ideas. Definitions will be divided into 3 half-hour films and includes drawings which he made during the talk. We've tried to represent them here as best we can. Definitions, Part 1. I am asked, what do I consider about the meaning of life as determining our destiny? Now, that would require a definition of meaning, life, destiny, and consideration. The important thing to begin with is to realize that we use terms, words, in order to signify things and events and relations between things and events. And if we do not get our terms correctly defined, then we're bound to come to grief. We know very well that in the world there are many different religious systems, and the adherents of these systems have periodically considered it to be an act of worship to murder each other. And that we know fundamentally these religions teach exactly the same things. They all talk about descent from common ancestry, from God, from spirit, from universal power. And yet, in fact, they seem to be prepared to fight and destroy each other in the name of universal compassion. We know that there were 5 crusades historically, where in the name of Jesus Christ a lot of people in Europe rushed off to regain the city connected with his historic appearance, and that in the process of fulfilling the commands of a man who said, "Love one another," thousands of people, including children, were killed. And we know that this arises primarily from an abuse of terms. Well, this might seem an oversimplification until we remember the power of propaganda, that a nation is determined largely by catchphrases. We know that during the war, at one period, Russia was called our glorious ally. We know that since then she's been called other things. We know also that promises were made, such as Germany shall not rise again, and we know that Germany is being rearmed against a hypothetical enemy. We also know that half the world is flying an atheistic banner, the Marxist banner, and the other half is flying a theist banner. And yet, fundamentally, the Marxist position is a declared intention to improve the conditions upon earth, and the Christian religion says there will be a new heaven and a new earth. Now, if we take the ethics of any great religion, we will find they are precisely the same ethics that the Marxist would declare to be his own basis of action. So we know that there is something fundamentally wrong in the way we think about these problems. When we go to study religious ideas as children, usually to Sunday school, we find that none of the terms that are employed are defined. People talk about soul and spirit, and yet they don't define either soul or spirit. An argument arises, has man got a soul? And the argument could not arise if we say man is a soul. In the book of Genesis, it says that the Spirit of God was breathed into man, and man became a living soul. It does not say man was given a soul, but man became a living soul, which implies that the soul is the very man himself. And if we were to go into the Zen Japanese Buddhist view, we would find that man is equated with unified will, that the will, the unified will, is the real man. So I want to begin by defining a few terms, so that at least we'll know what we're talking about. First of all, we say that things do not need defining. They're radically defined already. This room is defined by the walls that enclose it. So that when we are defining, we're not defining things, they're already defined. we're defining the use of terms. We say we define the limits of application of terms. We only define the application of the word. Now, to define is a word derived from Latin, meaning simply to state the end or limits. The fin in definition means end. If I wish to define, I must circumscribe. So definition is the same thing as circumscription. I draw a circle, and inside it, I say I will write all the words to do with a certain idea. So if I write inside the circle the word dog, and say that all about dogs has to be included in this circle. And what is not about dogs must be put outside the circle. So the circle is our limit. That is the fin in definition. To define is to indicate the limits of application of terms. Word itself we will examine later, but we'll say shortly it is the instrument by which we order our minds. Well, you'll notice O-R-D in the word word. This is from the root of order. A word is an instrument whereby we order the contents of our minds. So by definition, we mean circumscription, limitation. Not of things, they're already defined, but of the application of our terms. So, beginning with the definition of definition, we can then proceed. I'm going to draw another circle, and I'm going to say, let us assert that this circle represents the largest conceivable circle whatever. We would equate this word with the word macrocosmos, the great cosmos, the great universe. One of the theologians of the Middle Ages said that God can be conceived by conceiving a sphere than which there is no larger. This sphere is the sphere that includes all smaller ones. So we take this to represent the circle than which we can conceive no larger. And simply because that circle encloses, we say it has created the concept of unity. If we imagine the paper to extend itself infinitely in all directions and to have no marks on it at all, we would say that the paper is a potential of definitional possibility. In other words, we would say the paper represents simply a possible plane for receiving marks, and every mark we put upon it will be a definition. Thus, to draw at all is to define. So, let this represent the largest circle that we can conceive, and all subsidiary circles within it will be called subcircles of the whole. Outside this circle is usually called by the mystics the abyssal content. Now, if we write abyss, we normally tend to think it means a large hole, somewhere you could fall into without any bottom. So that when we look at this circle here, this is the largest circle we can conceive. Whatever is outside it is necessarily not circumscribed, because we have defined this one as the largest circle there is. So beyond the largest circle there is, we say, is the abyss. You'll notice that this ab is the root of the word abbot, abbey, Abba, the father, the Hebrew for father. The abyss is the father affirmer who affirms this first circle. Now, it is said in Christian theology there is God and Godhead. And outside is the Godhead and inside is God. God, by definition, excludes his worshipper because there is a relation. God is the object of worship. So when we say this is God, we have to postulate a worshipper. and without the worshipper there would be no God. If there were no intelligent beings to consider the supreme consciousness of the universe, then that God would have no point of reflection, and no one could define it. So there is a small circle inside, and we say the circle represents the whole of humanity. And then we can see the meaning of the statement, in him, that is the big circle, we live and move and have our being. So the big circle is representing God, and the little circle representing humanity, and they are in relation. So we draw a radius to represent the relating factor. Along this line of the relation is the path along which man has to tread to go from an ordinary human being conscious of the earth. Now, I put another little circle inside for the earth. I put a cross in it, which is the sign of the earth, the circle with a cross in it. Now, the man can either turn towards the earth, precipitate himself into materiality and concentrate on the accumulation of matter, or he can orientate himself towards the largest circle there is, which he calls God. Now, depending on the mode of his orientation, he will get certain results. Everyone gets the results of their own actions. Those people who collect matter, they collect it. Now, as a Jewish friend of mine said, to make money, you just need one idea. Just the idea to make money. If you have another idea as well, that contradicts that. You will split your will. So the question of orientation raised is a question of the direction of the will of man along this radial line. Now, I'm going to say of this smaller circle that it's not correct to use the term spirit for it. We use the term spirit for outside this smaller circle, whereas the substantial being symbolized by this circle is called soul. The word soul is made up of the same root as the word solo. It means to be on one's own, to be alone. To be alone is to be all one. So the idea of a soul is the idea of a unity of sentiency. Sentiency means feeling consciousness. If we then imagine a force going about in this manner that is free, not binding itself, never puts its tail in its mouth, that we would call the absolute spirit. But if that same spirit at some point turns on itself and rotates, at the moment of its rotation, at the moment it brings into being a sphere, it then changes the name from spirit to soul. Soul means the solo power, the power made unific. So that when we come to consider the statement in Genesis that God breathed his spirit into man and man became a living soul, it is simply an illustration of the fact that the absolute power of the pre-universe is itself able to turn in and to rotate, and in the act of rotating to produce unific beings, which we call souls. So let us now agree that when we write the word soul, we shall think of a solo spirit. We put the letter U in there, which is an old form meaning to go, to travel. You see it in the third person singular of the French, va, to go. You see it in the Sanskrit, vayu, the name of the air, to go, the goer. So the U in it means a unific goer, or a power unified and mobilizing itself. Now, we can see that if we do not circumscribe, we cannot have plurality. If this spirit wanders about and never at any time crosses itself and seizes its own tail, then it never makes a unity. It never makes a one. And consequently, the concept of plurality can never arise. But if that same thing proceeds to rotate, then go out and rotate again, then everywhere that a circle occurs, it receives the name soul. And although the spirit in all souls is identical, yet the fact of the rotation of each soul, separating it from the others, gives rise to the plurality that we recognize in beings. That means to say, the power in our bodies which ordinary materialistic science knows to be continuously going out of bodies and coming into bodies, and therefore belonging to nobody, is nevertheless the sole cause of the bodies. Bodies are simply rotations of power. As long as there is a rotation of power, there and another rotation there, it is permissible to talk about the plurality of souls. And yet we know that there is only one ultimate power. Viewed from the psychological point of view, this power is spirit. Viewed from the scientific point of view, it is an absolute force. Whichever frame of reference we use, we cannot consider the existence of many beings unless we think that there are rotations of force going on. You know that Sir Humphrey Davy on one occasion was lecturing to some students, and he accidentally inhaled some nitrous oxide gas, and it altered the state of his consciousness. And quite suddenly, instead of human beings sitting there, he saw in each seat a little whirling of power, a little force vortex. And from that moment he could never again believe in the gross material world as real. He saw every human being as simply a rotation of primary power. And the only difference between one person and another is the way they actually rotate. This word actual is tremendously important because, in effect, the absolute spirit in us is identical, but in spite of its absolute identity, in bodies there is a different mode of actuality, a different mode of activating itself. And it is the way that this spirit, or the will of the person, you can equate the will with the spirit, the way it activates itself that enables you to know that this is this person and is not that person. It is the content of actuality that determines the difference between people. We know that the actuality of a dog and the actuality of a cat are different. A dog actually waves his tail at you when it's pleased. A cat actually does so when angry. So although there is a tail waving or wagging in both cases, yet there is a different motivation behind the two, and they signify differently. And if you look very, very carefully, you'll find that the quality of the two motions is different, because it springs out of a different motive. There is a certain graceful movement in the cat's tail with a little angular flick on it, every now and then. Whereas in the case of the dog, there's a more rhythmical, happy look about it. Now, in the cat, you can see something of the serpent, and that little flick in the tail signifies the anger in it, whereas the steady rhythm of the dog's tail signifies its happiness. So there is an actual difference in the way a dog and a cat move their tails. Now, this actuality is tremendously important. Theologically, of God, it is said, he is pure act. There is nothing in him that is not actual. It means that the spirit, power, cannot be conceived as static. It's always on the move, infinitely and eternally, and therefore we say it is pure actuality. Whereas in the case of finite human beings, we know that a large number of their possibilities are not actualized. We say of a given fellow, oh yes, Bill, he can or could, if he would, do so-and-so, but he doesn't do it. Doesn't do it because he's got no confidence. If he had the confidence, he could do it. That means that if he had something that he has not, he could actualize something that he is not actualizing. And the actual differences between peoples, between nations, and so on, are the important differences on earth, because it is in actual fact that the quarrels between human groups break out. In general, they say that the big nations are actually afraid of the use of large explosives. Because they're actually afraid of that, they actually take steps to protect themselves. And all the steps of self-protection are potential aggression, and are viewed as such actually by the other nations. So the actual presence of fear in somebody precipitates acts of defense, which are acts of aggression. Now, let's look at the word act for a moment. This letter C here, it can be written like that, and used to be so written. So if we leave off the straight stroke and use it as a C, with the straight stroke, we would call it a K. The idea of it is the application of a force. In act, we apply a force. This is the force A. This is the application C. And the T represents the fixation arising from it. So if we say the intersection point, T, is the point on which we apply a force. Here is the K and there is the T, and the energy by which it is applied is the A. So an act is really an application of energy in a closed situation. Now, if I put my finger in this form so, and then tap it on here, if you listen very carefully, you'll find it's giving forth the same sound that the tongue on the back of the palate makes. The tongue pulled back makes the letter K. That is its origin. K. That gives a kick or a blow. If we look at the word kick, we find it's got one of these K at both ends to symbolize the application of this force. So every act is an application of a force that puts you on the cross. It means that when you act, you are doing something, putting yourself in a situation from which necessarily something will act back on you. This is the idea that to every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. In the East, of course, it's called karma. Karma actually means allowing your desires to run away with you. When the desire runs into a situation, you then find that you have acted. And if you act in a certain way, then immediately you have pinned your physical body in a situation. And you can actually be defined by some other people as having done that act and be required to pay the penalty. I'll do 3 kinds of acts now. I'll cut the human being into 3 parts. First the head on the spinal column, then there's the chest, there's the part below the diaphragm. Now there are 3 kinds of acting. There is the kind of acting with the physical body. We put that down there, which springs out of an unconscious impulse. You know, if you tap your knee suspended, you'll get a knee jerk. A nervous impulse runs up there into the spine and back again to the muscles and makes the leg react. That impulse has gone up to the brain and been thought about, and it's come straight out again. We call that a simple reflex. So this is a kind of simple, gross material reaction, the kind of reaction that wood gives when I tap it. Next, at the chest, we have emotional reactions. When you know that if somebody becomes in a terrible state of agitation and sits next to you, biting their nails, that you begin to feel on edge too. This is emotional action. They're actually applying fields of force, feelings of enmity or fear and so on, and beating them inside their emotional body. And then there is the act of reasoning. So we have three kinds of actuality here to consider: the act of your physical body, the act of your emotion, and the act of your thought. Now, simply because we know that our physical body has become big, although it was once very, very small, tiny little egg, it has become big by absorbing food. So this material body, which I can see and walk about and move, is sometimes called the food body, the body of food. And simply because I know that I put it into my mouth and then digest it, because of that, I know that it's not the essential in myself, it is something accreted to me. And it always accretes to me in the particular form in which I am. And to other people, it accretes in another form. So that every person we know manages to retain their own shape, even though they may eat roughly the same kinds of food. So we say they have another body, a body of form, the form body. Yogis would call that the subtle body. We have a body of ideas. Idea is the Greek word for form. The Saxon word shape is the same thing. It implies circumscription. If you can draw a line round something, that line has a character. And we call the shape, or we call that the shape or the form of the object. And there is a form body, a body of form, which packs the food that we eat into the form that we recognize. And we also have this emotional body, the body of feeling flux. Mediums use this feeling body a lot. And this body is free from ideas, free from the gross material body, so that although people might do right and think logically, they may have a very peculiar motive in their feelings for doing so. No, it is possible to have a totally wrong feeling. See, one can have a feeling of enmity for a person, say at work, and have a good reason for being polite to that person and getting on with the job and doing it properly, and be inwardly, emotionally fuming about it. And we find very often, if a person is doing something correctly, thinking correctly in order to do it, but feeling against it, that a division occurs in the will of the person. And if it is prolonged over a long period, then the person actually begins to sever certain connections between the emotional, the rational, and the physical body. This is the kind of thing that happens in neurosis. And we can see how very important it is to have clear ideas and to express these ideas in words which enable us to carve the human being up into compartments and then to tie the parts together again on the body. You know, in the Bible, in one place, it says Simeon and Levi, two of the 12 tribes, it says of them, they killed a man to their own hurt. Now, they symbolize the emotional and rational parts of a human being. And by his emotional and rational disintegration, a man is cut to pieces. But it says of Joseph, he threw a vine over the wall. Now, throwing this vine over the wall is the same thing as connecting together the separate pieces. Simeon and Levi are the emotions and the ideas that you have which tend to cut you to pieces. And Joseph is the man that's trying to integrate them together. So, here we have a diagram of the human body, and power comes into his body in a number of different ways. The spinal axis is the way that spirit enters into the body, and through the mouth, matter enters into the body. When the matter in the body falls down into the stomach, it's digested, and the results of the process of digestion are put into the blood. It is raised up, meets the oxygen in the air breathed in, certain actions take place between the two, and there arises in the body nervous impulsations which climb up and in the brain and become the energies of thought. But all the food that goes down there and climbs up here has come from the material side of our nature and is conditioned by its chemistry, so that all its tendencies, its actual tendencies, are forcing the body to move in a way determined materially, which means to say that the man who is merely determined from down below is equivalent to a beast. In all the great religions it says there is a spirit that goes down into the ground. The animal's head points to the ground. It feeds on the ground, and so on. But the spirit of man comes from above. Man is man, not because he eats, because animals eat, vegetables eat. In a certain sense, even matter absorbs energy, and therefore matter eats. But man is man because he receives something other than the energies from food. He receives an energy that comes from this free spirit as it enters his body and is turned around and becomes the soul. And the man himself, the spiritual man, is that soul, which is simply the spirit turning into a man. So there's no difference between the higher parts of the man and the Spirit of God, other than in the actual enclosures in man's consciousness. So that if a man thinks he is a finite being, limited, as he thinks, so he will become. If he thinks that he's a material being, he will start collecting matter. He'll put the matter into his stomach, and the more that stretches, the more he'll think he's conquered the world. And maybe he is conquering that part of the world. So there's a kind of reward in doing that. If the man opens himself to relations of compassion with other beings, then he receives a different kind of reward from devoting himself to eating up the earth. If he devotes himself to truth, which means he prefers to be logical in his thoughts, then he will receive another kind of reward. So, we have 3 kinds of actions and 3 kinds of rewards. And if we learn to think in this threefold way, we can begin to analyze our whole being, so that later we can consciously integrate all the various parts. Thank you for listening.